Thanks for tuning in to the Reframing Ministries podcast, where we provide strength for today and hope for tomorrow for caregivers and their families. We'd love to hear how these episodes have helped you. After rating, would you share your story in the reviews section of your preferred podcast app? Our team at Reframing Ministries loves to hear stories of hope and healing, and now we've played a small part in them. Now, here's Colleen.
Laurie, thank you for being with us today.
It's so exciting to be here. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Laurie, you have a book that's out or coming out, and it's called Why Your Weirdness is Wonderful. Embrace Your Quirks and Live in Your Strengths. And I want to ask you, Laurie, how did that start coming together?
It came together about a year and a half, 2 years ago. I was writing for my blog, and a lot of my clients have in the past struggled with how they just didn't like a certain aspect of themselves. And I work as a strengths coach, so I would help them figure out what their best features are so that we could really be efficient in how much energy they put towards those. And over again, I just saw people struggling. They just got stuck in the thing that bothered them most about themselves. And so I was reading another friend's blog, and she was just grieving over this aspect of her that I love. And so I wrote a response blog post back to her and basically said, what if it's not like that? What if that thing that drives you crazy about yourself is actually God ordained, not as something to practice growing and healing out of, but something you could use, as a positive tool. And she didn't believe me at first. And we went back and forth in the comments for a while. And then after a while, she sent me an email and said, you need to write a book about this. And I thought, I think that would be fun. Let's do it.
Did you really? What were some of the things that were coming up that she was struggling? Well, maybe not her, but just in general, what you were seeing some things in clients. What were some of those things that they were focusing on that they just couldn't get past?
Over and over again, I would hear people talk about how they wish that they wouldn't worry so much about things. That's a big one. Another one is feeling like they're not good enough, that they're not getting enough done. People in particular, like my mom and some other women who I really love as mentors and people who speak life into my life, they worried that they didn't have anything really as a legacy, like what would they write down as having accomplished in their life? They tend to be more of the relator kind, and they were frustrated with themselves over and over again because they didn't feel like they had some sort of physical, quantifiable legacy, something that mattered. And so things like that, worry and not feeling good enough, and people who would call traits about themselves negative names, like I'm a perfectionist, I'm a type A, I'm an overachiever, I'm an underachiever, I have my head in the clouds, all these kinds of things. I found myself starting to say, wait, hold on. Before you go that direction with that trait, what might that be trying to do in your life right now? Right. And let's see if we can unpack that.
Well, it could be trying to refine our mates.
It's definitely doing that.
I'm just kidding. No, but when we first talked and I received the manuscript, I looked through the beginning part and I started checking off all these things. So you had listed, let me look on here, to identify some things that can be frustrating. Like, here we go. These all related to my situation. You have the gift of
thinking. Yeah, they were mine too.
The gift of thinking of 30 things at once, but you can't start or finish one thing. Yeah. There's so many projects around the house. Or the gift of keeping peace at home and work, and yet so much internalized worry, which is something you just mentioned. The having nothing to say after you die. I've said to my husband 100 times, I think on my tombstone it's going to be she loved to laugh, she loved her husband, she loved her children, and there you have it. And you read another long one, and it can seem like, what is there to contribute? So I want to ask you, how do you turn the OCD, or what we would call an obsessive compulsive disorder or a perfectionistic disorder, not a disorder, I'm not sure the recipient of it, How do you turn those into positive things?
Well, I mentioned in one of the chapters, I kind of take readers through, I think it's 2 or 3 chapters where we really unpack one in particular from a colleague of mine, Mary DeMuth, who I really appreciate and enjoy. And she's definitely a thinker. She really mulls over stuff, and she thinks about things, and I appreciate that in her. And she doesn't always appreciate that in her. And so well, I unpacked that particular one with her permission in there. And so okay, so let's take a look at that obsessive compulsive one that you picked. So that's what the need to stew over details and to have everything in its place and to have things predictable and in order and those kinds of things. Those can be really valuable in certain situations. It's just that they aren't maybe in a context that's life-giving in those moments where we would think of them as obsessive compulsive. So, for example, having everything in its place, that kind of organization God reveals in his character. He's got everything in its place. Every bit of our body, every of the myriad functions that are going on without us even knowing it are happening like clockwork in a way that is very organized and very much set on a time that he's set in advance. And so organized and detailed and structured and everything reveals God's heart. And we need to basically partner up is the idea with how he does it, because God lives all of the possible strengths we could ever have in a really life-giving way. He does it perfectly. And so if we could spend less energy kind of fighting what we want to call a negative trait about ourselves and instead ask God, so how do you do this? I want to do it the way that you do it.
Well, then we're talking about really the character of God. And it comes down to the formation of our character. When I looked at the title, Weird, and Why Your Weirdness is Wonderful, you had referred to it in several different ways. And I looked it up and I thought it was fascinating because it says, these 2 words were together, odd and fantastic. And I thought, how great is that? Because odd would be the quirkiness or social uneasiness, but then the fantastic talked about unbelievable, unimaginable, unthinkable. And so you're talking about transitioning from, let's not think of this as odd, but let's look at this as this is a pretty fantastic quality.
It is. And one of the things that got me started towards this idea was maybe 10 years ago, I first encountered a tool called Strengths Finders through the Gallup organization. And it had, and I'll have my clients do this a lot too. We'll take this assessment and it just barrages you with these questions, like 180 questions in 20 minutes or something. And you just have to go with your gut instinct. And it shows you what, the answers that pop up to them, they can kind of assimilate and show you what things you're naturally good at. And those qualities that we have, it's mind blowing how unique we are as people. My cat wants to get in on this action right here.
Hello, cat.
But the thing is that Gallup reports that for any 2 people to have the same top 5 strengths in any order, they're not even in the same order of, predominance in our life, how often you would see them, it would be 1 in 250,000 people, really? Something like that. And and then even better is if you tried to match it up in the same order, it's something like 1 in 33 million people has a similar looking set of strengths that happen in a similar, type of occurrence or, amount of occurrence in your life. And that's not even overlaying your spiritual gifts, your life experiences, your personality traits, and all of that. I mean, we literally are diamonds. All of us. We're fantastic. We're amazing, and that's what I want to get through to people with this book is, it's a loss if we don't know how God's designed us and how important that is for us and for people around us.
Well, he tells us that we're fearfully and wonderfully made, and we can say that, but how often do we go to the negative? Now, I thought it was pretty interesting that you brought in Paul's passage in 2 Corinthians 12:9, where he talks about the thorn in the flesh and how he prayed for that to be taken away. He talks about it and some of the commentaries that I read said it was some kind of chronic, debilitating, perhaps exceedingly painful thing which kept him at times from doing God's work. So that would be something, I'm sure he'd think, well, if I just didn't have this, then I would be able to do God's work. But God did not remove it and yet used it to form his character. And then I told you about the commentary by Barnes. He says, when calamities cannot be removed, such as the child or the friend who may die, blindness or deafness or loss of health or poverty, so there is no hope of removing those things. And thus our reaction is to cheerfully acquiesce to the will of God. To submit fervent prayer was not answered in the way we think it should have been, but in the way God allowed it to be answered. I think for those of us who struggle with, for me, I know there's some depression at times. There's a lot of anxiety, worry. You mentioned perfectionism, OCD, your mind not turning off. Those can sometimes seem like they are interferences.
Yeah.
How do you tie all that in with God, with Paul's thorn in the flesh, looking at it negatively, and yet it's a positive thing?
It is. And I think that's where we can tease apart sort of the weirdness idea from weaknesses in our lives, because they are really two different things. So the way I define weirdness is essentially as a quirk. It's a tendency about us. It's something that we naturally do. It's what we go to first when we encounter a situation. And it may be something that's developed over time because of our life experiences, or it may be something we just came out of the womb with, like my baby girl who just all the time.
She'll be great as a greeter at church.
I know. No, she popped out, and I thought that might be how my parents saw me when I was little, until I found a microphone and started speaking. Like, just no, it doesn't turn off. But she talks a lot, but she has so many positive things to say, and everybody gets annoyed at her in the family because she's constantly talking, and that becomes a weakness when it's unloving towards people, and when it is whining, and when it's out of her pain and out of her stress and that kind of stuff. But it is a strength, that quirk about her, because she can turn around the mood of a situation, because she's got this joy about her, and it's just spouting off every second that she's awake until she talks herself to sleep. It is absolutely hilarious.
Isn't it bedtime yet?
What?
I said, you gotta go. Isn't it bedtime yet? I mean,
yeah, there are those moments. So that's where a quirk becomes a weakness. So that's what I go into in the book. I think what Paul's talking about is a physical, possibly, weakness. A lot of people think it might be a vision problem, or it might be some kind of painful body issue, actual physical issue. Nobody really knows, but that is more of a circumstantial issue as opposed to something internal in him. It seems from the reading that I've done about that issue. I'm not a theologian, so I don't know. I'm not definitive on this one, but it seems that is more of an issue he has to deal with versus something he is. So that's where the weirdness part is. It's something that we are, and it can become a weakness if it's not loving God and loving other people, basically following the greatest commandment.
Right. Which I think this brings in a whole spiritual aspect, because you said, like with your daughter, talking, how we can become intolerant, and yet the Lord calls us to live harmoniously together. Or there could be this kind of uproar in the house, and yet he wants us to be peaceable. And so there's a part of character formation that goes into this that I think is vital in learning to relate with one another. Tell me a little bit about, you and I have talked before about some experiences that you had with your daughter, one of your 4 children, that was kind of an awakening for you. Yeah.
And you mentioned the character formation piece. And I think that as we begin to understand the value that God has woven into each of us individually, and we start to open our eyes to the possibility that the things we hate about ourselves are actually good in some context, then we automatically go right to, then that must be happening in someone else around me. It must be happening in the people I know and the people that infuriate me, on a regular basis. And then from there, for me, the journey went to do I relate with you, God, in these kinds of ways too? I mean, a friend asked me, actually, a fellow coach had mentioned to me, how do you use these strengths, these weird things about you with God? And I thought, well, that's a weird question because, isn't this stuff supposed to be like how we relate to other people on a horizontal level? I didn't think of using any of my strengths or personality traits with God. It seems like you almost have to strip that off to have this spiritual relationship with God. But the more that I thought about it, the more I realized, he wants me to use them with him, but I don't know what that means. And then, the one instance you were mentioning is really where that opened to me. And it was the year that my younger adopted daughter, just after years of working with her and all of the counseling and the mental health stuff that we had to go through with her, she was failure to thrive when we got her, and really just had trouble pulling out of that in a lot of ways, emotionally as she got older, more than physically. And so she was in this residential psychiatric facility for 18 months. And at one of the visits, it was around the time that I was really grappling with, how do I live these good things with you, God? Because you've pretty much got me at the bottom of a well. I'm just stripped of everything that I think I'm capable of doing. I felt undone by that year because I'd put, 7-8 years into this little girl, and she was getting worse. And there's just nothing like that as a mom, to level you as a person. And so I felt empty and I felt pretty incompetent, and I didn't feel like I really had much I could do with my strengths with anybody at that point. And so I look up, because that's what we do when we get to the bottom, right? And I was sitting in the room visiting her at the center, and we would go a couple times a week, and I would sit there with her, and we would play board games and do all these things that seemed like normal activities, except that they were very wrong because they were happening in a place where she wasn't supposed to be. And, if God really heard me, and if he actually gave me skills and strengths that mattered to the world, wouldn't they have made a difference in her life? So I'm sitting there with her feeling crushed, and I'm thinking I should pray with her, because that's what you do when you're a Christian for your, hurting whoever in your life. And as I started to pray for her, it sounded like always, like, God, would you heal her? Would you lift her out of this pit? Would you do what you promised? Would you make good on your promises for her? Your heart is for the widow and the orphan, and here's an orphan, and just, would you love her? Would you bring her out of this pit? And of course I'd prayed that a million times. And at that point, God, I felt, said to me, hey, there's a reason why you have skills that I gave you. Why don't we use those here? And I'm thinking, this doesn't have anything to do with this. I can't believe I'm still thinking about this idea, and then I started to pray instead. I thought, well, what would it look like if I prayed in my impulsiveness and in my opinionated kinds of quirks? I can be real opinionated, and I can be bossy, and those are good things when you're standing in a spiritual gap for somebody. And that was honestly the first time I feel like I really prayed, because I stood there, like literally got up at one point with my daughter and held her. And I said, God, with you, we command these afflictions to leave my daughter, and I felt like he was kind of whispering to me, kind of just little ideas would come to mind, and I would say what came to mind, and I would speak it over her and speak it at whatever was going on. And it was very foreign, and it felt really weird because I had never really prayed like that. But it also felt like home, like I found myself, with God in that moment. And it was like, that's why you gave me these quirks, you want to boss the enemy back to where he goes through me. And you want to, like, on a whim, do it, like, impulsively, as it comes to mind. And you want me to just jump in and do it, like I do things. And it's like, wow, that was really exciting. And things have started to turn around for my daughter because of it. It has steadily gone on an upward trajectory since then. And it's not been easy. And it's, we've actually uncovered whole new disorders and diagnoses and needs for medication and all that stuff since then. But she's a different kid.
I know that the book isn't targeted for an audience specific to disabilities or special needs, but you've just said a couple things that are really, really core to raising a child that has disabilities or being an adult with, as you would say, quirks or funky things that are going on. I have all these questions going through my mind, so I'll have to see my mind's 30 things at once. What was that like for you, first of all? Because I think parents listening will say, I've tried everything. We've tried everything. I've read every single book. I've gone to every parenting class. I've read the Bible forward and backward, and I've prayed like James tells us to pray, and there's no healing and there's no change. What was that like for you?
It was like when we figure out a little bit more what God sees when he sees in us, we get to know him a little bit more. And honestly, the challenge shrinks. It got so much worse after that moment in prayer with her that I had to have her in my line of sight for the next 5 months. Because
really?
She's having seizures that at one point, one almost drowned her. She just had a seizure and fell into a pool. And I had to have people watching her all the time. It was so high intensity after that. It's not like it got easy, but easy isn't the point. The point is great. God is great. He's not easy. He is amazing. And that greatness becomes more tangible when we understand some things in us that God put there that are reflections of him. So then we look to him and we say, oh, you're bossy, and in a great way. You command evil to stop. You will command it go ultimately for eternity. And we get a little sliver of this when we notice in us the things that we may never have given him credit for, because we've always called them something negative. So I think it makes God bigger when we realize a little bit more about how he's made us, and it doesn't heal the problem. It doesn't make it go away. And I know that. I mean, I'm in the middle of it still with my daughter. She still has some very long lasting, hang on forever sort of issues. And I don't know if they'll ever heal, but my God got bigger through this process, and that works.
So in other words, Paul's words are very relevant in that although we pray and we don't see change, it doesn't mean that he is not at work. It means that he is choosing to allow whatever the circumstance to work in us a character that will be more in line with who he is. He gets a lot bigger. In fact, Your God is Too Small is one of my favorite books on earth, because we have him in so many different categories, and yet we pretty much have to get shattered in order for us to see the bigness of God. And it sounds like you went through some of that. Yeah,
definitely. I think what it also revealed to me is that character development doesn't have to be miserable. That the joy of the Lord is our strength. And there's a reason for that, to figure out to actually have a sense that you, as you learn how God made you in all of these weird and wonderful ways, are linking arms with him and on this adventure with him. I love how John Eldredge talks about it as this epic story. We're a part of this epic story with God, and as we kind of link in, arms with him and with the people that we understand better and better, it becomes this adventure. It becomes this life-giving, almost exciting sort of process for us. And it's not like a, like a Monty Python.
This is awful.
Yes, I'm getting better character. It becomes a journey. It becomes an epic story.
And I have to think some of the disciples must have felt that at times. I mean, just,
yes.
Here they are following this guy who was considered incredibly weird and was known throughout the Roman Empire. And he's got these people who are considered, outcasts and losers and whatever. And that was his team. But it was, let's team up together. And that's what I think I'm hearing you say. The Lord didn't change your daughter. In fact, it got harder. But maybe he was saying she doesn't need to be changed. But I'm going to change you, and together we're going to help her see who she is as she's created in my image.
And that's a huge point, because we all, as we start to see and to do a little bit of the unpacking of these traits in ourselves, like I said, it turns us automatically towards the people we're interacting with, and we become these ambassadors of good news, literally, that like all of that weird, there's got to be something great about it. And it changes a negative interaction that we have with someone who's really stressing us out or frustrating us in the moment. Like with her, I would sit there when she would steal or lie or do any of the kinds of reactive attachment disorder behaviors. And I would say, what could this be if God had it? Like, what if we put this in his hands? Like, what is this? And the more that I've done that with her, I'll literally ask her, when I find out that she's taken something from someone else, I'll say, what could you have been trying to accomplish? What could that have been in a life-giving way? And we will figure out that she knew that a friend really liked that particular cartoon character. So she took that pencil from somebody else because she was thinking of somebody else to bless. And I'm thinking, that's sort of easy. We could do this on an up and up sort of way instead of the deceitful
stealing. We're not going to encourage, but gift giving, we will.
She's being thoughtful. She's being intentional. She's wanting to bless a friend of hers, and the method was not okay. And there's consequences for that. But we can talk in terms of how could that weirdness be wonderful? How could that need to sneak? Like, what is that? That is you wanting to meet a need, and then your fear is taking over, and it's becoming not loving to other people because you're taking things or you're losing their trust. But what you're really trying to do is meet a need that you see, either yours or somebody else's. And so how can we, resource you to meet needs? And, she would take stuff out of my purse to give to homeless people on the street and stuff like that. And so I'd be missing money, but they had it, so then it's like, let's do this on the up and up,
right.
Let's let God breathe into this moment. And why don't we make sure you've got some extra money so that you can hand stuff out when you see a need? What if what if I remind you as we leave the house, grab a couple extra granola bars to hand out as we are around town, kind of a thing. And so it becomes a partnership as opposed to that behavior or that response from you is making me crazy. It becomes how can I, partner up with you? I'm linking arms with God on my own weirdness. And how can I link arms with you now and kind of both of us walk with him in this? It really diffuses a lot of pain. It's been a huge factor in my husband and I, making it these 15 years together.
How has that been in your marriage?
Honestly,
that's what this is about. Honestly.
Yeah. That was the first stronghold that I think this idea broke through. Mm-hmm. And that was what inspired me to become certified as a strengths coach. because when I took that Strengths Finders assessment, it was for some leadership position in the church I was attending at the time, and he took it as well. And as soon as I found out what his strengths were, I thought, oh, like when I'm totally stressed out at the end of a day and you walk into the kitchen and say, honey, I was thinking we could rearrange these cabinets. And I'm thinking, you need to step away before I throw a spatula in your direction. He's actually just thinking of ideas. And that's one of his top strengths, is just to brainstorm. And so what I can do in that moment is two things. First of all, I can say, is this a fully baked idea? Because I'm the one who, as soon as I hear a good idea, I'll just shoot off right away, not necessarily always thinking through all the steps of how I'm going to get there. And so I was feeling like he was a tyrant, like he was not seeing me and he was being demanding, but he's just thinking of ideas that could work better for the kitchen. And so I can say, so is this an idea that we need to do right now? Or is this something you're just thinking about? And that takes a lot of the stress off. Or I could say, you know what? Love that you think of ideas. Can you write them down? Because right now I have zippo tolerance for anything except maybe a giant hug. So, we can be on each other's team. I can recognize what he's trying to do, and I can let him know where I'm at, and we can relate in that, and we can work together to bring these strengths into more of a wonderful context.
What I'm hearing you say is really looking for the good or the best behind what may not be the best. And it reminds me of a story when my kids were really, really little. It was pouring down rain outside, and I thought, how are we going to have a good day today? Because they both have so much energy. And so I had all these little plastic beads, and I hid them everywhere. And I said, you guys, we're going to go out and we're going to find some joy. And they thought it was the coolest thing in the world. I'm so glad you think it's a cool idea. So it became the joy bead game. And I said, everywhere you go, you can find joy, or you can find God. You can find something in every situation that, if we turn our perspective in a different direction, really is a cool thing. Now, stealing, no, not so good. Lying, not so good. But
no,
part of our broken self, let's refine that. In the book you mentioned, I thought this was interesting, Philippians 2:2-5. What I loved about it, I wrote it down here, and it says, are your hearts tender and compassionate? Then make me truly happy by agreeing wholeheartedly with each other, loving one another and working together with one mind and one purpose. Don't be selfish and try to impress one another, but be humble. Thinking of others is better than yourself, and look to the interests of others. And I found a quote by C.S. Lewis that says, humility is not thinking less of yourself. Humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less. So add to that. Tell me a little bit about why you brought in that passage in Philippians of being truly compassionate, because that sounds like what we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think that if we can put on the lens of, this weirdness in them is as wonderful as what God's showing me mine is, like if we can see the world like that, then we become, honestly, to me, I think it becomes what his kingdom coming on earth as it is in heaven is like, because we see them more like God does, and that's what compassion is. And you really don't care as much about yourself in a situation when you're seeing these amazing things in people around you. You can really invest without a fear that there's, not enough left over for me, or there's not enough, my needs aren't getting met, because that they are, and you see opportunities to be about, my Father's work on earth, to love on people and to help them to be what he's designed them to be.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot of time to think about yourself when you're looking for these qualities in others. And sometimes you got to dig a little deeper. Tell me a little bit. Sometimes you got to dig real deep. Tell me a little bit about how this works out in the church, and how, especially in working with parents who have children who are different, we're so quick to judge. We're so quick to point out the negative. in a church setting, how would you bring this into it?
I'm already doing it. We actually are doing a program right now with the women in our church, and the more that I have the opportunity to speak, it's always coming into that. It's easy to build this in to church.
I want to come.
Because I want you to come.
Okay.
We really, it's about saying, hey, what has God designed us to be? And how do we line up with that as people? And it's about looking at specific situations. What I'll do with groups of people and what I've seen other churches do with similar types of ideas is basically look at some situations that have come up and how were your strengths trying to come out in that situation, and how are they coming out, wacky or as a weakness in that situation? And then what do we need to do to repair that relationship because of it? Because this person has this set of quirks and strengths, and this person has this set, and they clashed, and it hurt some feelings, and maybe it caused some consequences situationally that need to be resolved. And there needs to be some work there so that we can forgive each other and kind of reframe how we see each other moving forward. And then as a group, knowing that this is what you love and are good at and are naturally good at, and sometimes it comes out wonky, and this is what you are good at and it comes out wonky. Like, what are some pitfalls we can avoid in the future? What are some, catchphrases that we can design? What I've done on retreat teams that I've been a part of that have actually been based completely on this idea, which was awesome. It was such a fun experience to be part of that. Is basically I'd say when I was stressed and getting frustrated because I'm like wanting to get going. That was my job on the team, is like, okay, good. We've talked enough. Move in. Let's do it. Activate on that. And other people just want to sit and think on these ideas and really get it just right before it gets going, which is awesome. And I appreciated those people on the team. It would have been half baked if I would have done it by myself. But I would just have to talk myself down, be like, so really, if we did it right now, what could you be missing? And I'd be thinking, oh yeah, then there's that, and then there's that, and then there's that. Okay, right. So just stop and listen to them, and it's uncomfortable and I want to get moving, but they have a point. So let's stop and give them space. And so kind of developing ways that we talk ourselves down from getting riled up about someone else's quirks. And then kind of ways that we can remind each other, kind of like, I'm just thinking out loud right now, so we can put this in practice when we firm things up. Those are kinds of ways we can build that into the church, because it builds a vocabulary that honors who we are as individuals and honors that it's hurt other people sometimes, and that's where humility comes in. It's kind of like, yeah, sorry about that. I recognize that probably ran you over just then. So
now, how is that part of forgiveness? Because I think that's a huge piece that you're talking about.
Oh, it is. It's enormous. And I think that, and learning how to grieve and let ourselves grieve more than we think we are supposed to, because we don't deal with grief in our culture very well, but little things can grieve us. And I think in particular, as special needs families, we know this maybe better than most people, because we're going through little shreds of grief, every day with different things that our kids go through. But I think on the whole, as a society, we need to be able to admit that something has hurt us before we can actually do the work of forgiveness. And that's where the grieving part comes in. So we have to be able to say, actually be attuned to what's going on with ourselves enough that we can say that hurt, as opposed to I'm angry at that person, and to go through like, what loss did that cause? And it may have been something tiny. It may have just been losing, perceived losing face in front of other people, which may not have happened, but it felt like that to us. So that's the loss, the little feeling there, the big feeling. And to admit that loss is the first step to forgiveness, which then becomes, I see what you did, and this is how it felt to me, and I let go of the need to exact punishment on you for that.
Because of the grace that I have been given. It all falls under the grace that God has given us. What was your favorite chapter to write in the book?
I think the one where it starts with me as a middle schooler running for ASB. So I don't remember which number chapter that is, but that was really fun for me to go back and kind of process some of the early weirdness coming out and how early it can come out, which I think is fun as a parent now to think of. I've been like this, as long as I can remember, and to go back to that moment when, I wanted to change the world as the ASB president of my middle school.
I
Of
can't
300.
imagine.
I know, right? So, and so I just going back and thinking of the details was fun for me of how I actually thought that I was going to revamp sort of the whole food service system in the district by getting a couple signatures from friends, and that a 13-year-old could actually do that. And I was new, to the neighborhood, and I had no idea yet that people don't care how much you know until they know that you know them and that you care about them. And that was not my business. My business was revamping huge issues, saving the world. So,
Right.
when they threw pencils and food at me during my speech, that, my whole ideology as a 13-year-old came crashing down. And, but looking back on it, I see it as a really cute, funny, quirky beginning to what I do all the time now. So
you're talking really about mindfulness, about self-awareness. You're talking about obedience and the call that we have to love one another as Christ loves us. You're talking about grace, forgiveness. And I think one of the cores I'm hearing again and again is humility. At 13, you wanted to do these great things, and yet there was some breaking down that had to happen, which has happened through the challenges with your daughter. For the special need parents, what word of encouragement would you have if they have been hurt, and if they are struggling and kind of at that bottom of the pit place that you mentioned? What words of encouragement would you have for them?
I would say that you have an infinite pool of resources ready for you to tap into, and that most of it lay in what God has designed in you. We think we go into these moments woefully underprepared, but the honest truth is God designed us for what we're doing, and we have more than enough to face whatever's coming. And if we would just turn eyes to him and say, I don't see it. Would you show me what I've got here in this situation?
Yeah. Like what Paul says, I pray that the eyes of your heart would be open. And really,
Exactly.
He's talking about the eyes of your soul. That you're looking in one direction that looks like no. I'm wanting you to turn your eyes and your soul towards me, because that's where some amazing things can happen. Laurie, as we end our time together, I want to talk about how people can get a hold of you. And you're doing a lot of speaking, a lot of teaching, and I think there are probably a lot of churches that will want to have you come and help them pull these things together. So I have to read. Your email is lauriewallin@gmail.com. And these are going to be in our show notes. I'm going to get my glasses again. And then you have a website, lauriewallin.com. And it's LaurieWallin. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Awesome. And then your Facebook page is Facebook Living Power Life Coaching. Don't get too worried about the coaching word. It's mentoring, coaching. Really, it's directing, and enlightening. But you also have a Twitter page, which is My Living Power on Twitter. And then your book that we just talked about. And then the link for the book, I'm going to put in the show notes because it's kind of written weird here. http / Are there any last words that you would have or that you would like to leave before we end our time?
Absolutely. The next time that you get frustrated with yourself, I want you to look in the mirror and say, God, what are you trying to do right through me right now? And give yourself some space to listen to what he says.
That really is powerful, to ask, what are you trying to teach me through this? I'm sure as you've watched Laurie in all of her joy explain the direction that the Lord has led her in, and she has mentioned some things like OCD and a daughter who had some attachment issues and some challenges that are pretty big. Something could have struck a chord in you. Maybe you are at the bottom and you're saying, I don't know where to look, and I don't even want to look in a different direction because I don't trust that the Lord is listening to me. I want you to know He is. And He's using that very situation that you're in right this minute for you to get your eyes back onto Him, and He's going to do some amazing things. So I would love to talk with you in our comment section as well. And I'm sure if you want to connect with Laurie, she would love to chat with you. She's a great chatter. Laurie, thank you for being a part of this today. It's wonderful to talk with you.
It's been so fun. Thanks for inviting me.
Good. We'll write another book. We'll do another one. Have a great day in sunny San Diego.
Thank you. Enjoy your day as well.
Thank you again for joining us today. We hope you'll join us again for future discussions with Colleen and world influencers. The Reframing Ministries podcast is a production of Insight for Living Ministries.